Good morning, everyone. A big thank you for such a generous introduction and for co-organizing this workshop. The current geopolitical situation is not very inspiring for a discussion of Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery. Nonetheless, it will happen, and it is with that thought in mind that this workshop was conceived and organized. It is no secret to experts and scholars who observed and studied Ukraine that when Russia first attacked Ukraine in 2014, the Ukrainian state was too weak to defend itself. Ukraine made some efforts to raise its defense capabilities after 2014, but the full-scale invasion in 2022 revealed that the work was not finished, and the state still heavily dependent on Western support and on the population to self-organize to stop the invasion. At this point, Ukrainian authorities had to speed up two processes. One was to organize the military defense against the Russian troops, and the second task was to capitalize on the surge of patriotism and consolidate the state from within. The first task required Western help. The latter required boosting reforms, some of which began in 2014. In June 2022, in Lugano, Ukrainian authorities presented a new package of reforms designed to make Ukraine a strong state. They declared a strong commitment to implement sectoral reforms and boost Ukraine's progress towards integration in the EU. By the end of 2024, it became clear that in addition to sectoral reforms, the state will have to address the very specific problem of mass poverty, which rose 1.7 times between 2021 and 2023. That is, from 20.6% to 35.5%, as quoted in fourth rapid damage and needs assessment from February 2025. The tasks for Ukraine are sound, clear, and undisputed. However, the question is, does the Ukrainian state have sufficient institutional capacity to implement the necessary reforms? And a slightly different but related question, does the state have people's support and trust to implement the reforms? And if it does not have the capacity at present, how can it obtain it? So the purpose of this workshop is to discuss the institutional capacity of the Ukrainian state as it prepares to implement reforms. But before we begin the discussion, I would like to say a few words about how Ukraine, the second largest European country, bigger than France or Germany, with 50 million citizens in 1991, with exit to two seas, Azov and Black, and some of the best agricultural lands in the world, spent 23 years of peace and another 7 years of relative peace between 2014 and 2022, wasting its potential and underperforming as a market economy and democracy. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine inherited a weak state. On the one hand, it had formal institutions such as the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary branch and law enforcement organs. Ukraine also had economic infrastructure sufficiently developed to form a cohesive economic complex. Civil society was practically non-existent. However, the Ukrainian population was highly educated and rather politicized. Ukraine did have an ideology which could replace communism, that is Ukrainian nationalism. On the other hand, Ukraine was poorly prepared for transition to a market economy and democracy. Ukraine had a very weak legislative base to defend private property rights, individual human rights, and political freedoms. It had no formal mechanisms in place for the enforcement of policies devised by the executive branch. Ukraine lacked the legal and fiscal capacity to raise taxes and support Ukraine's transition from decaying socialist economy into a market economy. In addition to this, Ukraine inherited institutionalized regionalism, which manifested in the dependence of the Ukrainian executive branch on the regions for financial and material resources. On top of that, Ukraine inherited a bureaucratic culture with high level of informality and low level of formalization of rules, procedures, and an absence of formalized accountability for the state, political, and economic actors. As for the actors, the majority of the new political elites were, in fact, old Communist Party functionaries who had no experience in policymaking or running an economy at the state level and had little knowledge about what the market economy was and how it worked. The concept of entrepreneurship was just as alien to them as the concept of political responsibility. Even before the Soviet Union formally collapsed, Ukrainian authorities had to deal with two immediate interconnected tasks. The first was to consolidate the Ukrainian state, and the second was to stop the economic crisis and rapid impoverishment of a majority of the population. For the first 3 years, Ukrainian authorities struggled to make any progress. By 1994, inflation reached 10,000%, and the regions demonstrated strong centrifugal tendencies. To stop Ukraine from disintegrating, Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, agreed to hold early presidential elections, and when lost, peacefully transferred power to Leonid Kuchma. Kuchma's government succeeded to stop the crisis and began consolidation of the Ukrainian state. The choices he made, however, were not optimal for the long run. The executive branch immediately took a conciliatory tone with the regions and recognized regionalism as a characteristic feature of the Ukrainian state. In the 1996 newly adopted Ukrainian constitution, local self-government was granted official constitutional status, becoming one of the pillars of Ukraine's constitutional system. But the reconfiguration of the relationship between the central government and the regions stopped right there. Instead of relying on cooperation with all regions as a group, the state authorities choose to rely on the old Soviet principle of centralized state control over the economy through A, state distribution of resources, as opposed to control of the economy through market mechanisms, and B, by relying on a small group of large economic actors who controlled heavy industry for economic growth and state revenue, and thus the consolidation of the Ukrainian statehood. Heavy industry was concentrated in the east of Ukraine. Fiscal and economic policies were drafted and implemented in the interest of this one particular group of large businessmen. By the end of the 1990s, Ukraine became an oligarchic system, whereby the oligarchs used all means available to them to maximize own profits, whereas state and elected officials prioritized personal needs and wants over state interests. In words of Anders Aslund, and I quote, "A rent-seeking iron triangle of government, oligarchs, and parliament controlled the nation," end of quote. The oligarchic system determined the path of Ukraine's transition to a market economy. Stabilization programs to tackle poverty and slow economic growth were repeatedly violated. The Ukrainian state implemented limited reforms, largely imposed as a condition by the IMF and or World Bank in return for loans. The state focused primarily on tackling the symptoms, such as corruption, rather than deep causes of the state weakness and economic underperformance, such as the lack of secure private property rights, or the conflicting set of constraints and incentives for state bureaucracy and state and elected officials. In fact, Ukraine became a typical case study for scholars of institutions, as it now illustrated, in words of Darren Acemoglu, and I quote, "Institutions are not typically chosen for the good of society, but imposed by groups with political power for their economic consequences." End of quote. By the early 2000s, Ukrainians viewed their state as being led by clannish subordinate state machinery, functioning under the principle of strict hierarchic dependence and personal loyalty to the heads of powerful clans, thus consolidating the gang clientele social order. To signal their resentment of the fact that the mafia and criminal world had become the main economic actor in Ukraine, in the 2002 parliamentary elections, people granted victory to the opposition, Viktor Yushchenko's party, which promised to implement the necessary reforms. The message was not received, and in the 2004 presidential elections, Leonid Kuchma tried to peacefully transfer power to his handpicked successor Viktor Yanukovych behind the facade of democratic elections. This choice led to what went in history as the Orange Revolution. To defend the real results of the presidential elections, Ukrainians went to the streets to protest and support their presidential candidate, Viktor Yushchenko. It must be emphasized that the macroeconomic data was on Kuchma's side. The economic record showed considerable improvement after the crisis of the early 1990s. However, the main winners from Ukraine's achievements were few and personally close to public office holders. The Ukrainian state was failing in its function to fairly divide state income and adequately address the problem of inequality of opportunity, as well as income. The uprising was broadly a product of real economic grievances and decremental relative deprivation suffered by the majority of the Ukrainian electorate during the transition. But despite the electoral rhetoric, President Yushchenko did not implement any substantial reforms. The oligarchic system survived and thrived. When global economic crisis gave signs in 2007, President Yushchenko and his Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko, negotiated with the oligarchs as the only group able to mitigate the effect of the global crisis on the Ukrainian economy. Yushchenko's failures to make the state more inclusive motivated people to vote for his opponent in the 2009 elections. His opponent was Viktor Yanukovych. Viktor Yanukovych was even less interested in consolidating the state from within than any of his predecessors. Furthermore, in contrast to Yushchenko-Tymoshenko team, who lacked state discipline but remained largely devoted to democracy, Yanukovych immediately demonstrated authoritarian inclinations. Under Yanukovych, the country continued to underperform. By 2013, after 22 years of transition, Ukrainian GDP was still smaller than it had been in 1991. Corruption was rampant. Ukraine ranked 142nd out of 175 countries on Transparency International Corruption Perception Index in 2014. The taxation system continued to incentivize ordinary Ukrainians and businesses to participate in the informal or shadow economy, which by 2013 had reached around 40% of GDP. Loopholes in the legislation and regulations allowed selective protection of property rights, favoring a small group of 5–10% of the population. The system of targeted distribution of social transfers was failing too. In 2013, only 42.3% of all funds for state social support reached only about 30% of the poorest population. The rest, 57.7%, was allocated elsewhere, including the 5–10% of the population who were super rich. In 2013, the Gini coefficient for Ukraine was 45%. For context, it was between 20 and 25 for Eurozone. Spatial inequality, which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet system, remained well in place. Western Ukraine remained the least developed economic region. Civil society, which showed some potential in 2004, was unable to create pressure for reforms. And since the GDP was growing and the profits of the oligarchy group in power, the state felt no need to reform. Unsurprisingly, surveys held in 2013 showed that 61.5% of respondents did not trust the institution of the presidency. The Verkhovna Rada, or the parliament, was not trusted by 74.7%, and the government overall was not trusted by 65.8%. Indeed, Ukrainians were brought to the point when their only hope to correct the pathologies of the Ukrainian system lied with the external actor, the EU. So when in autumn 2013, Yanukovych refused to sign the EU association agreement, Ukrainians had little choice but protest. The events that unfolded went down in history as the Revolution of Dignity. It brought down Yanukovych and his regime, but it also opened a window of opportunity for Russia to invade. The Russian invasion in 2014 gave some hope to people that state authorities would finally focus on consolidating the state from within. A new round of reform designed to increase state-society cohesion was launched, some with more determination and success than others. Civil society had increased its presence and pressure on the state to implement reforms. International organizations, too, provided Ukraine with expert support while putting pressure on the power elites. However, the fundamental changes necessary to ensure protection of private property rights, which is the fundamental prerequisite for a market economy, and unleash the potential, the economic potential of the country, were not made. In 2018, the World Bank concluded that in Ukraine, labor, taxation, and social policies must be upgraded to address rising inequality. World Bank experts came to the conclusion that the time had come for a new social contract with a fairer way of sharing risks and opportunities. A new social contract became a new catchphrase for state officials for years to come. The state clearly stated that it expected the people to share risks, but it was not ready to share access to opportunities. By the next presidential elections, Ukrainians were ready to protest once again. This time, they showed their protest during the so-called electoral Maidan, when they voted for a complete outsider, Volodymyr Zelensky, to be next president of Ukraine. Several years into his presidency, Zelensky's ratings were just as low as his predecessors. Once again, a new group of people in the same institutional structure brought no systemic change. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Ukrainians came together in defense of their country. Given that the Ukrainian officials in all branches had low trust on the eve of the full-scale invasion, it would be safe to say that people picked up weapons for their country as they hoped and knew it could be, not as it was before the invasion. Indeed, since the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainians only increased their hopes that the war will force the power elites to transform the state. According to sociological polls held by the Razunkov Center, only about 20% of respondents believed that the country was developing in the right direction in 2021. In September-October 2022, the number of optimists had increased to 51%. in March 23, the number of optimists peaked, reaching 61%. Once the situation on the front more or less stabilized, the number of optimists began to subside. In September 2024, the Razumkov Center established that 65% of respondents were not satisfied with the situation in the country, and 57% were not satisfied with the existing social unfairness. And yet, despite the re-emerged cleavage between the state and society and low trust of Ukrainians in state authorities, public support for democracy remained high. After it reached 81% in July 2022, it reduced. Still, in April 2024, a plurality, 42%, believed that only electoral democracy can guarantee the rule of law, independent judicial and enforcement of law. 23% believed that the country should combine democratic procedures and a strong hand. Only 19% would welcome a strong leader and his political party. The Ukrainian authorities, the state officials regularly express determination to proceed with the reform, so hopefully the political will for painful, well, for the elites, transformation will happen this time. Our discussion today is focused on some elements of Ukraine's institutional design, the fundamental problems that Ukraine needs to overcome, and the opportunities that the system holds for the country to develop the potential of its state and society. And we begin our discussion with a presentation of the very problem that motivated people to protest in 2004, 2013, and in 2019, that is inequality. So this is a thank you from me, and I'm giving the word back to Ms. Vic to carry on. Thank you.